The following is a transcription of an audio cassette I discovered in my father's safe, shortly after he died. The tape has been transcribed for you here in its entirety, for my own sake. Can you say that again?
Which part?
The date that the recorder wasn't close enough. I want to make sure we get everything.
Why is it so important that you get every last detail anyway?
Because that's what the doctor said, Dad. The more detail we get, the better he can help you.
Oh, is that right? He's gonna help me, huh? How's he gonna do that exactly? Stuff some more magic pills in my pocket? Maybe sign me up for group therapy? Those are always loads of fun.
No, I think he just wants to get a better understanding of...
He can't help me. Nobody can. Better psychiatrists have tried and failed. You wouldn't believe me anyway. There's no point.
Well, if nothing else, it would help me and the doc to make better decisions regarding you. Look, I promise that I will listen to everything you have to say. I promise I'll believe you, okay?
Don't say that. You can't promise me something like that. It's all bullshit, and you know it.
Alright, fair enough. I promise that I will try to believe, okay? I'll try. Look, forget about the doctor, alright? I want to know what happened that night. Me. I want to know what you were doing in Norway. Why you can never get a damn good night's sleep. Just tell me, please.
Fine. It's February 20th, 1943. That's when it all went down. The Axis powers had been almost driven out of Africa, and the Soviets had efficiently turned the tide of war in Eastern Europe. We had the Nazis on the run, for the time being, at least. They were vulnerable, sure, but they still had every capability of rebounding and kicking our asses. As such, the U.S. was particularly interested in taking out any and all Axis weapon development programs.
Weapons development programs? What, like their tanks or the atomic bomb or...
Exactly. The Allies, specifically, targeted their hard water factories to cripple their production of atomic bombs. But there were other targets. Their so-called Wonder Weapons project, scattered all over German-occupied territory. Manufacturing depots, chemical weapons labs, bioweapon research centers, etc., etc. That's what I was doing in Norway.
Where in Norway did they send you?
Northern Norway. Far off the mainland lay an island with a Nazi outpost on it. Very little was known about the place at the time regarding its exact purpose and mission. According to our spies inland and the Norwegian rebels, the locals referred to it simply as Fort Ond. They said it was a bad place, that the prisoners who were taken there were never seen again, that the water bordering its shores were barren of all aquatic life and colder than even the most bone-chilling frostbite. Command didn't give a shit about any of that, though. They were only concerned with two things. Why is this installation so far away from German homeland, and why is it so far from mainland Norway? The conclusion they came to was that the Nazis had to be developing some sort of weapon that they didn't want to risk infecting a lot of people with.
So, they thought it was a chemical weapons plant?
No, they thought it was a bioweapons lab. Smallpox, anthrax, that kind of stuff. We thought that's what they were doing there, but we didn't know for sure. That's when my unit came in, and where Operation Maelstrom was greenlit.
Maelstrom?
I didn't pick the damn name anyway, so they wanted to keep the operation as covert as possible. Minimum manpower, one squad of British SAS, one squad of Canadian commandos, and last but not least, one squad of Army Rangers, including yours truly.
Was the purpose of the mission just to gather intel, or...
Our first priority was the eradication of the fort's inhabitants and the seizure of any relevant intel. However, we were also prepared for it to turn into a sabotage mission at a moment's notice. Leadership felt pretty confident about the bioweapons theory and didn't want to take any chances with letting the stuff potentially get away, hence the limited manpower. The last thing we wanted was for the Krauts to get spooked by a large invasion force and flee with the samples.
Dad, are you okay?
Yeah, just give me a second.
Really, you gotta do that now, huh?
What? Oh, I'm sorry. Is the smoke gonna bother your little nose that much? Would you prefer I did it somewhere else?
I prefer you didn't fucking do it at all. Though, in a way, it's oddly inspiring. A senior citizen, part of the greatest generation, still puffing that shit all these years, like it's of no consequence to his health.
To hell with the consequences. Can I continue now, or is this gonna turn into an intervention? 'Cause if so, tell me now so I can save you the time and just leave the room to enjoy the rest of my smoke.
Yeah, please continue.
We were all flown to Iceland for our briefing. From the moment I arrived, I had no doubt about the operation. The sheer lack of intel we had to go off regarding fort-sized manpower and the exact purpose just seemed odd to me. I remember thinking to myself, I hope there's enough men. When I did so, I caught my friend Weathers looking around too. I could tell he was thinking the same thing. From there, we boarded a British destroyer that took us less than 10 miles from the island. We had to travel the remaining distance on our own in 2 PT boats. I remember just how cold it was that night, how we all subconsciously stood closer to each other than normal in a vain attempt to stay warm, like a bunch of penguins, the lot of us. It was a half an hour ride to the island, so we stayed like that for a while, just hunkered up and trying to keep warm as much as we could while we waited for any sign of something. When we were about a mile from the island, we got the sign. We saw it long before we got near the stuff. When we did, we all went silent and watched as we slowed down our boats to make a cautious approach. A thick fog had blanketed the sea around the coastline in all directions for about half a mile. It had a faint red hue to it. Not a deep red, just a faintly visible one. It towered above us nearly 15 feet in the air like a tidal wave and seemingly stared us down. We slowly crept our boats up to it inch by inch until our bows were nearly kissing it. From there, a few of the Canadians on the adjacent boat got some equipment and began prodding the fog for any signs of toxin. We all sat there and waited for them to finish their work. As they did, I took notice of the absolute unnaturalness of it all. It made no movement towards us, nor away from us, yet it billowed and contracted and breathed soothingly in places like you would expect a body of smoke to do. I remember distinctly thinking of it not as a wall, but more like a veil or a curtain, hiding the island from us. A few minutes later, the Canadians signaled over to our boats and gave our commander, Captain Hawks, the thumbs up. The fog wasn't toxic as far as they could tell. Given our mission, though, we couldn't take any chances of it being gas of some kind. Better safe than sorry. So we donned our gas masks and made sure our suits were nice and sealed up. I, in particular, had taken the liberty of duct taping around the gloves and boots to ensure it was tight. Then, we started our boats back up and slowly sailed into the unknown. First, I couldn't see anything. The fog was so thick it limited my visibility to just a few feet in front of me, and even less in front of that boat. We couldn't have our lights on for fear of being spotted. When we were out in the open water, this was fine, of course. The moon and stars lit up the surrounding water nicely. But now, there was little to no light penetrating the fog, and we were engulfed in near total darkness. So we just slowly inched our way forward, safely as we could. I just sat there and watched the red vapor hit and dance off my goggles when I searched for any sign of land. For a while, nobody said a word. We all just waited for what seemed like an eternity. The longer we pushed ahead, the tighter the grip on my rifle became as my nerves started up. Finally, one of the Brits broke the silence. I watched him tap the man in front of him and heard him whisper, "You sure this is right?" His sentence was quickly interrupted. We had landed. The entire boat shook wildly as a few of us lost our footing and had to grab the side walls to stay upright. As we did so, I looked around me and noticed the fog gradually growing thinner as we made our approach. Steadily, its opacity diminished, I could begin to see shapes through the veil. The crunching noises ceased a few seconds later, and with them, so did the fog from my line of sight. It was still there, but it was thinner and lower to the ground than it was on the open sea. It only came up to our knees from that point on, which meant I could finally see our objective, the island. It was a mess of scattered jagged rocks and hills, caverns and towering cliffs that seemed to scatter in all directions, like a porcupine made of stone. At its center, one giant hill stood out. I followed it from the base to the peak with my eyes, and at its peak, there was a door. That was it. No trace of human life, no pathways, no trenches, no buildings of any kind. Nothing that would suggest any sort of operation that we were undertaking on the island. There were a few guard towers, of course. We knew at least that much from our aerial photos, but we had chosen our landing site specifically to be in a blind spot they wouldn't see us from. That was it, though. Apart from the door that stuck out amidst the terrain, looking utterly unnatural in the distance, there was no sign of life. No buzzing insects, no splashing fish, no chirping birds, not even the wind itself seemed to bow before the island's authority and ceased completely. No life whatsoever. I thought back to when my first encounter of the fog and just how right I was in my thought process. I truly had crossed a veil of some kind. Captain Hawks gave the hand signals. We all filed out and patrolled inland as fast as we could to a nearby cave. The Norwegians were waiting for us there.
The Norwegians, were they the ones who gave you the fort's intel to begin with?
The very same. Adding them to our roster brought our total to 35 men.
Dad? It's okay, Dad. Take your time.
We headed into the cave and linked up with the Norwegians, who sat steadfast in a defensive position. One of them stood up as soon as we breached the darkness of the cavern and swung his gun over in our direction, shouting at us, presumably to lower our weapons, before quickly lowering his own to make a half-hearted apology. Hawks was livid. He stormed over to the man with one forceful strike of his fist and sent the poor Norwegian hurtling towards the ground. "You some kind of fucking moron, kid? I was this close to blowing your goddamn head off." The commander of the Norwegians rushed over to stand between the two of them. "Please forgive us, sir. We've been on the edge since we arrived a few days ago. It was an honest mistake." He helped his fallen soldier back to his feet and ordered him to the back of the cave to tend to his face. Afterwards, he and Hawks stared at each other for a few seconds in silence while we all just waited to see who would speak. The leader of the Norwegians spoke first. "Something is wrong, very wrong. Our intel is severely off," he said. "None of the guard towers have occupants, and we haven't seen Nazi soldiers patrolling the island in 3 days. We've been spying on the island for weeks now, as best we could. The entire time we did so, the soldiers were patrolling the shores, manning the towers and watching the coastlines. 3 days ago, this fog emerged, obscures our vision, and made it nearly impossible to see anything on the island. Since we arrived, we've done multiple sweeps and scouting runs along the island's surface before you arrived. No one is here, American, not a soul. It's like they just vanished, at least from the island's surface. I looked back over at McKinley, who did the same. We exchanged confused looks at one another before looking back at the two leaders, who were now talking too quietly for anyone to hear. Finally, Hawks turned to face us and gave a deep sigh. We think the Nazis have locked themselves away in the fort's cave system and interior. According to our good buddies here, the island's surface is safe. Let's hope they're right. Conduct final checks on all your equipment, then form up by the cave entrance. We're going in. So we got into formation and made our way up the rough terrain to the door. It was the one I had spotted when we had landed. As far as we could tell, it was the only entrance to the interior of the fort. The absence was nerve-wracking. The cold, wet staircase that led up to the fort entrance proved difficult to scale with all my equipment, which was made all the more dangerous, of course, by the fog. With it clinging about knee level on every surface of the island, made it damn near impossible to see where you were stepping, so we just slowly tiptoed our way up to the door as best we could. All the while, nobody uttered a word. So quiet I could hear my own heartbeat throbbing in my ears. Eventually, we reached the top of the stairs. The door itself was monolithic.
Monolithic? What? Like ancient?
Oh yeah, stood nearly 9 feet tall and looked like it was made out of bronze or copper. I don't know, some kind of faintly orange metal. It was covered in strange engravings that could only be described as hieroglyphics. They weren't, of course, but that was the only comparison I'd been able to find since that day. And believe me, I've tried. I looked through every damn book I could think of. Nothing comes close to the symbols and markings I saw engraved on that door. It was like a foreign language of some kind. Didn't look like it was written or chipped away from the door by an expert's hand, so much as it looked like it was slashed or cut. Like something had hacked its way in with claws or teeth to create the strange writing. It didn't look like a human hand had done it neither. Looking up at the door, I felt like an explorer, like I'd found something lost to mankind for millennia, and I was rediscovering it. Only I didn't want to be the person to discover this. At that moment, I wasn't sure I wanted to be aware that this place existed, let alone be the one to have to open that damn door and walk into God knew what. We readied our explosives, expecting to have to breach our way in. To our surprise, though, the wooden beam that was attached to the door lifted. The monolith opened slightly, and with it came a stench of utter and all-devouring rot, like pus and spoiled milk, bile and sulfur, all fused into one unholy concoction that assaulted my nostrils and instantly forced tears down my cheeks. First I panicked, believing my mask wasn't secure, tight enough, and I was inhaling a toxin of some kind. But when I looked up and saw that all my team members were doing the same, our masks all working fine, we couldn't have all had potential leaks, right? The smell was truly just that powerful. The door had only given way and opened a tiny bit. A front man quickly had to ask for help as the door was too heavy to heave by himself. 4 men, including me, pushed with all our mights and then quickly ran out of the way as soon as the door was completely open, so the guys behind us could aim down that opening. When they did, they didn't see much. Their flashlights shined straight into a wall, angling down and away from us. What lay before us was another staircase, carved out of the very stone of the mountain itself. The fog clung low to the ground past the doorway, only coming up to about ankle height, but it still obscured the steps all the same. We stared down the doorway, waiting for orders to advance, but Hawk said nothing. He just stood there with his gun trained ahead and his other hand held up, silently telling us to wait. I suspected he was listening. waiting to hear any communication from us opening the heavy door, for any sign of enemies. There were none, however. Not a sound could be heard from down the staircase, just like everywhere else so far. Goff leaned over to me and tapped me on the shoulder. "Something's not right, man," he whispered. I did not respond. I didn't feel I needed to. Everyone was already thinking the same thing anyway. No point in vocalizing it, especially not when I think we could all see what Hawks was thinking. I watched a chill run up his spine that shook his held-up hand and rifle slightly in place. I'd never seen him like that before. He steadied himself, and with a low, reassuring grunt, which was probably more for his benefit than ours, he gave the order, "File in." So we went. We descended for about 20 feet. The staircase itself was dark, but we could see light at the bottom. The sight of light was a relief. Instantly, I felt a tiny shred of my anxiety wither away as my instincts took hold. I readied myself for any Germans that might be waiting for us at the bottom. There were no Germans, though. None left anywhere. None alive. When I reached the bottom of the staircase, the scene laid out before me like something you'd see in a crime scene. It was a big square room illuminated by gas lanterns in its center. The door directly ahead of us led to an opening in the floor with a ladder hooked to it. 2 doorways on our left and right, like a plus sign or a cross. Various crates and workstation desks lay toppled over, all facing the direction of the newly discovered staircase, like sentry posts. They all faced towards the same point, scattered throughout the room where the Nazis, half sunken in the fog and slightly obscured by it, draped over the crates, leaning up against the walls, crumpled up like soda cans in the corners. There were at least a dozen of them. Their blood pooled beneath their feet, but I hardly noticed it through the tinted fog. I took a step forward, and that's when I heard the familiar jingling of empty bullet casings beneath my feet. Subsequently, bullet holes could be seen in nearly every square inch of the wall in front of us. "Jesus Christ," Weathers shouted as we entered the room, prompting Hawks to hold up his hand and signal for us to shut up. "Whoever the fuck did this might still be here. Stay frosty," he muttered sternly to us. "Fan out. Check the room on our flanks," he commanded via hand signals. Half our men went to the room on the right, while the remaining went left. I, along with 3 others, stood guard in the lit room, kept our guns trained on the ladder ahead of us. As I knelt behind a crate to take a better defensive position, I noticed one of the Nazis was laying face down in a puddle of his own blood. I kept my rifle trained ahead as I slowly reached over and heaved on his shoulder, forcing him to roll onto his back. He had a look of utter terror frozen on his face, with eyes wide open and mouth agape. He bore cuts and large slash marks up his chest and torso, which caused his entrails to expose themselves slightly. I looked around the room at the other men to verify, and sure enough, the ones who were submerged in the fog shared similar wounds of size and volume. The fuck happened here? I thought to myself. That thought was quickly overtaken by a doubly terrifying realization. I looked at the bullet holes directly ahead of me and thought, whatever the hell happened here, I'm standing in the same place they were. After a few tense moments of sitting with that realization, the squad checking the right room emerged, holding a few books and folders. They bore similar engravings to the ones seen on the door upon our arrival, and were bound in leather so ancient that it looked like the faintest breeze would disintegrate them if they weren't careful. They showed it to Hawks, who took one of the books and began sifting through the pages. At first, he scanned the pages carefully and thoroughly, but he quickly thereafter began to shuffle through them frantically and impatiently, before reaching back and shoving it into his pack. Right about that time, the squad from the left room emerged, a British Soldier approached and said, "Just more dead krauts, sir. There's something. We found cages big enough to fit a human in. There were bodies in them, but they weren't German. Civilians," the Norwegian team leader interrupted. "These were fucking animals." Hawks looked like he was getting ready to say something, but he didn't get the chance. All conversation and thoughts were stopped when the sound of screaming could be heard down the ladder. With one uniform motion, all remaining men turned their guns to face the same direction, as I already was. We waited for what felt like an eternity, for a head to come bobbing up in the opening of the floor, for the sound of footsteps, for any sign of enemies. Nothing came. After a few minutes or so, Hawks gave the order. We were going down there. I really didn't want to do this anymore.
Dad, please, you can do it. Just take a second, okay?
The smell, Patrick.
What about it?
I can't get it out of my nose. It's been 60 goddamn years since then, and I can't get it out of my nose. God, by the time we reached the bottom, Goff had already vomited. I had to fucking cover him while he did it. Good thing I hadn't eaten anything before the briefing, else I would have too. When we reached the bottom, there was nobody, just like the rest of the island. No signs of life.
Dad, what did you see at the bottom of the ladder?
Well, it was a large cavern-like room with multiple passageways that branched off in all directions. But at its center was a well, made out of the same stone as the mountain. It somehow looked older, more ancient, more monolithic. Along its rim were the same damn etchings and carvings as the door. Upon closer examination, we saw what the source of the fog was that had plagued us since our arrival. We watched it for a while and observed the fog billowing up and out and over the top, well, in all directions at a constant, unnatural rate. Couldn't believe that such a tiny source could have produced as much as we'd seen up to that point. I couldn't believe that the colossal wall that we'd encountered upon our arrival originated from such a minuscule well deep in the mountain. As we spread out to cover the other passageways, I approached it and leaned over. Patrick, the smell was so strong that I was thrown back onto my hands and knees almost immediately from the stomach contractions. It was the source of the fog, of the smell, of everything.
What was in that well?
Blood. The whole fucking thing was full of blood. More blood than I'd ever seen in my life. More than the room upstairs. More than any other mission I'd ever seen on, and it was fresh. It boiled gently. It seemed to move on its own as though it were alive and aware of our presence in the room, and when I gazed upon it, the attack on my nose and stomach seemed like one of calculation, as though a cobra had spat in my face for daring to get too close. I wasn't allowed even a second to recover from the stench, however. At that exact moment, we heard more screams. Seemingly every passage in the cavern emitted what I can only describe as a wail of anguish, like the flesh was being peeled off somebody's forearm and pouring salt back into the wound at the same time. They pierced all our ears like razor blades and made me wince so hard I almost forgot about my stomach pain. How big is this place? I thought to myself. What the hell could be happening just down those tunnels? Fuck this, Hawks said. Start planting charges. We are getting out of this place as soon as possible. It was music to all our ears. One of the soldiers came over to check on me and the rest as we began to start laying charges. There was nothing professional about our process. We were just laying them out as fast as we could so that we could get the hell out of that stenched place and back to the boats. The screams continued the entire time we worked.
Were they getting closer?
I don't know. They sounded like they were coming from every passage all at once, but it was hard to tell. We had a man eyeing down every doorway just in case, though. Didn't matter. We should have been watching the walls. As I struggled to compose myself to get back to my feet, I had a front row seat for what was about to happen. Goff, the poor bastard, he was doing his rounds, laying his charges along the floor, around the well. I wanted to speak up, to tell him not to get too close, but I was still sucking in air through my teeth and couldn't get the words out. All I could do was hold my hand out to him and grunt. He turned to face me. "You gonna make it?" was the last thing I heard him say. At that very moment, an arm shot out of the well behind him, locked itself around his neck, and pulled him in head first. The arm was inhumanly long, more like a tentacle than an arm, but its form was undeniably human. It wrapped itself around his neck and dug its fingers into the side of his face as it dragged him deeper and deeper down. I watched him thrash around and kick his legs wildly in vain as he attempted to get free, spraying torrents of blood in all directions around him. He was already halfway submerged by the time our men got a hold of his feet. When they did so, another hand shot out of the wall and locked itself around Goff's waist, now pulling him in faster. I could hear gurgling and see bubbles of air making their way to the well's surface. Poor bastard was drowning in that putrid liquid. The men pulled with all their might, but it didn't slow down his descent in any noticeable way. They heaved and barked orders to the others like rabid dogs, desperate to save our comrades, but no help came. We were alone with the incomprehensible, and it was winning. The rest of us simply stood by dumbfounded and watched as he was forcibly dragged into the well, inch by inch. When it was clear that the men could do nothing more, they let go and took a few steps back. Their entire arms were covered in blood to the elbow. For a moment, nothing happened. Nothing said a word, moved a muscle, did anything. We all just faced the wall and tried our best to process what had just happened. It didn't last long. The well began to gurgle and bubble as though it were digesting my friend. It began to overflow, slow and thick crimson liquid oozing over the top of the well and onto the cold stone floor beneath, making its way towards us. I was the first to move. I stood up and began to slowly step backwards towards the ladder. That's when the massacre began. In an instant, all hell erupted around us. The same arms that had dragged my friend to a then unknown fate sprang out of the walls around us as the island became alive and began to frantically swing around, searching for bodies to claim. A few of them found their mark and pulled some of the men towards the walls, wrapping themselves around their necks and locking them in place and suffocating them. Any sense of composure our toughest men had remaining left their bodies that very moment, and we all made a mad dash for the ladder. The room was only dimly lit by all our flashlights, though. When we broke our formation and began to run, our visibility became significantly limited. Bodies ran into each other, and men began slipping on blood that now reached for their feet. The fog had all begun rising in intensity at a startling rate, and was now almost as thick and copious as it was out on the sea. This made it all the more hard to tell what exactly was happening, and before I knew it, I was knocked onto my ass by one of the Canadians as he ran straight into me. The blood rose higher and higher at an inconceivably fast rate. It was halfway up my knees by the time I regained my footing. When I did, I felt a sudden rush of movement brush past my leg. It's when I saw it. There were shapes moving in the blood, large, serpentine-like shapes that slithered all around us and began to quickly encircle my team. Like sharks, they enveloped us, poised for the kill. They seemed to be probing us for weaknesses, waiting for the exact right moment to strike and take as many of us down as they could. I wasn't gonna let them get me. My body moved independent of my paralysis psyche as I sprinted for the ladder and reached as high as I could to escape the cavern. However, the ladder was barely wide enough to fit one man on it. It was made of wood and was not meant to support the weight of more than a couple of men at a time. I remember just how careful we had to scale it just to get down to the cursed room in the first place. I worried it was going to give way any second and I'd be stranded in that room with those things, with the well. I felt it crack and buckle beneath me as more men than intended all tried to climb it at once. I pushed into the men above me just as the person did below me, all in a desperate race to escape. Just when I was sure all was lost and I'd never make it out, I reached the top and rolled onto my back. As I did, I heard a loud snapping sound, followed by 8 loud splashes hitting the liquid below. I rolled over and shined my flashlight down the hole to look at the scene and try to help some of the men escape what would now become a tomb. It was no use, though. It was 20 feet down. I couldn't reach any of them. Weathers, McKinney, they stared up at me and shouted for help, but what was I supposed to do? The blood had risen to above their waistbands by that point, and there was more of those fucking things circling them. They climbed over one another in a desperate attempt to get enough height to reach the exit, but I was nowhere near enough. I felt so helpless. I watched the mysterious shapes and figures in the blood creep up to them from behind. Then, as if coordinated, in an instant, they pounced and dragged 3 men under the murky depths at once. In that split second, when they had leapt from the pool to attack the men, I caught only the faintest glimpse of their true form. They were like eels or leeches with spider legs and beaks. Something of that family, but it's still not an accurate comparison. They were truly otherworldly, inhuman, even to creation itself. They were abominations that I'm glad they were obscured by the fog, as to have glanced upon them in all their unholiness would have been too much for me at that moment. They yanked the men down into that ocean of blood. As they did so, the men thrashed around chaotically and knocked more men over, making the already futile pyramid of terrified men all the more pitiful. That's when I noticed the 3 that were taken by those serpents were being dragged towards the well. They were being dragged to the well so it could devour them, just like Goff had been taken away to that unspeakable fate. I looked at the edge of the room to search for the first victim of the attack, the one who had been forcibly dragged towards the well by the arm. When I found them, I felt my stomach churn once again. Their bodies were halfway into the cavern walls. Their arms were dragging the men head first into the island itself to be consumed. It was as though the island was alive, the well was alive, and it wanted us dead. The remaining few screamed and pleaded and begged for me to help them. All I could do was stare down at the chaos before me and watch. I was ripped out of my comatose state by a firm hand on my shoulder. It was Hawks. "Get up. We gotta get out of here." He picked me up by the back of my shirt and dragged me to my feet, pushing me up the staircase. I didn't have a plan. I just ran. My body was truly on autopilot. Couldn't think of anything other than the men we were leaving behind, and the looks I saw on the faces of those men as they screamed at me for help. The fog had now completely engulfed the inside of the fort, and I struggled to maintain my footing as I ran as fast as I could through the first chamber and up the staircase. As we exited the main door, I was stopped dead in my tracks. I heard gunshots behind me. By God, they were still alive. They were still fighting to get out, and I was abandoning them. Hawks once again yanked me by the back of the shirt as he went past, encouraging me onward. "There's nothing we can do for him. We gotta get to the boats now." And with that, he ran off ahead of me through the red smoke. Every fiber of my being compelled me to go back, but my body refused to obey. I just stood there trembling, white knuckles grasping my rifle as I struggled to make a choice. After a few agonizing seconds of contemplation, I followed after Hawks and made my way to the boat, to freedom. As we sped away from the island, I was able to slowly creep back to the real world mentally and finally take note of my surroundings. It was me, Hawks, and 3 other British troops. Only 5 men had made it out. None of us said a word. We all just kept to ourselves and stared off into space, doing our best to process what had happened. I looked back at Fort Ond one last time before it disappeared over the horizon. The fog had grown larger now, redder, hungrier. When we got back to the destroyer, we told command everything that we had seen and what had happened. They didn't believe a word of it. I can't really say as I blame them. We must have sounded insane. Showing up, missing 30 men, covered head to toe in blood, rambling about a mysterious well, our friends being dragged away by an unknown creature to an unknown fate, ancient bronze doors, and slaughtered Nazi soldiers. They told us that we had most likely been exposed to nerve gas, that the base was being classified as a possible chemical weapons lab, and that when we inhaled the fog, maybe we were subjected to hallucinations. But we were sealed up head to toe. We stood up for ourselves as best we could. We all corroborated each other's stories and validated each other's testimonies. We swore up and down till we were blue in the face that the island was not what they thought it was, that our friends had been killed by an unknown force, and that we had to destroy the fort. They just stared at us like we were a pack of lunatics. They had made up their minds about what had happened to us on the island. Any attempts made by any of us to get the record straight only served to make us look even more insane. I turned to one of the admirals and spoke up one last time. I had to know something before they turned us away. "Please tell me you guys are gonna level that place." He stared at me for a few tense seconds before simply saying, "We'll handle it." And with that, it was over. All the remaining members of Operation Maelstrom were discharged the next day, deemed medically unfit to continue service. Each of us was briefed individually on the events of that night, and I was told not to utter a word to anyone about the events of Operation Maelstrom, or to disclose the fort's location to anyone. The colonel who was briefing me told me, "For the record, I believe there's at least a little truth to what you told us. But regardless, you and the survivors are a liability now, unstable and erratic. We can't risk putting any of you onto another operation, not after what happened to you. Or at least, not after what you think happened to you. I'm sorry, but this is for your own good." I was put on a plane the next day and sent home. That's it. You don't believe a word of what I just said, do you?
Well, no, not all of it. I mean, I want to, but it's a little too much
I know. I know how it sounds. You think I don't hear myself saying this shit to you? I know how it must sound, but it's true, son. The well is real. What happened to me was real.
I'm sure it must have felt that way, Dad, but you've gotta...
You don't believe a word of it. Nobody does. You, the doctors, every other person I've confided in just thinks I'm a lunatic who imagined all of this. I see the way you're looking at me, like I'm just a poor old man who's losing his mind. I know what I saw. I know what I went through. You weren't there.
I know I wasn't. I'm not saying I was, but Dad, come on. Work with me. Isn't it possible it was a nerve agent or something? How the hell would you know it wasn't?
'Cause we all saw the same damn thing. All the survivors of Maelstrom gave the exact same testimony upon our return. Everything from our encounter with the fog to our return to the ship was synced up perfectly. What do you think, we all hallucinated the same thing?
No, I just think that maybe...
You know, they took the books that Captain Hawks acquired. Oh yeah, they made sure we kept nothing from our mission. Stripped us bare right after we returned to the ship, but told me what he saw in those pages. More of those strange symbols, those hieroglyphics of unknown origin. The mention of Torzur Hole, some kind of portal to hell or somewhere worse or God knows where. You want to know why I can't sleep at night, Patrick? The real reason is 'cause I know it's still there. We'll handle it, they said. Yeah, like hell they did. They probably just set up shop themselves and tried finishing what the Kraut started. Or maybe not. Maybe they heard our warnings and listened to us. Maybe they shelled the place into oblivion and actually did handle it. But I'll never know, son. I'll never get my closure on the events of what happened that night. I'll never get to know with 100% certainty that the well has been sealed and that whatever lies in the depths of Fort Ond can't get me anymore.
Let's just take some deep breaths, okay? Why don't we just calm down and...
This was a waste of time. It always is with people like you.
Dad, please.
We're done here. Turn that damn thing off and get...
The tape ends there. I couldn't find any additional tapes in my father's belongings. So, for the time being, that's where the story ends too. I didn't know my grandfather too well. He died when I was 12 and was a recluse. So, sadly, this tape is one of the only glimpses I've ever gotten into his life. I don't know what to believe. It's easy to write him off as crazy or the victim of a gas attack. But the fear I heard on that tape sounded so real. That's gotta mean something, right? If nothing else, the torment he endured was real. And maybe that's all that matters. Or maybe, just maybe, he's right. Maybe Fort Ond still stands, exactly as he described, hidden somewhere behind the veil of fog.